Hello, class. Today we are going to study from another prophet and his prophetic book who belonged to the 7th century. So today we are going to study about Prophet Nahum. So let me start sharing the screen so that we can follow. Okay, Prophet Nahum belongs to the 7th century. So let's see a little bit about him and about his book. The book of Nahum is a quite an uncomfortable book to read. Means people do not feel very comfortable, or they are not they don't feel very comforted after reading the book of Nahum, and hence many a times people try to avoid reading this book. Many of the people do not even have not even gone through this book even once in their lifetime. So it is not a very big book. It has only 3 chapters, and in total it has only 47 verses. Its main theme is the destruction of Nineveh, the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. And the vivid descriptions that are found in this book actually make it very uncomfortable to read. It reflects Israel's deep hatred for Assyria and its dreams in the aftermath of the Assyrian fall. So after the Assyrian kingdom has fallen, okay, after the Assyrian kingdom has fallen, there is Israel feels a deep hatred for it, because we know, because of the treatment that Israel has gone through because of Assyria or by the Assyrians. So they have a deep hatred set in their hearts for Assyria, and they have been praying for the fall of the Assyrian kingdom. So this book actually talks about a lot of the vivid pictures or the judgment that comes upon Assyria, and Israel is happy about it and rejoicing about it, because Assyria is their enemy. So Nahum is one of the least known of the Old Testament prophets. He comes from a place called Elkosh, which is actually not identified till now in a proper way geographically. So his name occurs only here and once in the genealogy of Jesus, that is in Matthew 3, verse 23, chapter 3, verse 25. But whether this is the same person, this Nahum is the same person, it is unknown, or it is unsure. So let's talk about Prophet Nahum first. So Nahum is one of the 7th century prophets, and he prophesied along with, or he had the prophets that accompanied him, or prophets that prophesied along with him in the same period, were Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and Obadiah. In 722 BC, Israel fell to Assyria due to their sins. Okay, we all know that Israel was sinning. Okay, Israel was had fallen deep into sin against God, and God had to send judgment upon, or he had to purge the kingdom of Israel, and he used Assyria as a tool or as his instrument so that he can judge the nation of Israel. So in 722 BC, Israel fell to Assyria due to their own sins, and this had been prophesied by most of the prophets, or all the prophets of the 8th century BC. And now, after the fall of Assyria, we know that Judah alone stood the time. Okay, so it was natural that Nahum would have rejoiced over the destruction of Assyria now, who were one of the cruelest nations of that time and had oppressed and persecuted Judah for nearly a century now. Okay, so we have to understand now that before the fall of Israel, Assyria had already risen to power. Probably around 8th century BC, we know that Assyria had risen to power, and Assyria was the instrument in God's hand, and God judged Israel using Assyrian kingdom. And we know that Assyria was a very cruel nation, and it was very barbaric, it was very cruel, and the way they dealt with the nations was very cruel. And after the fall of Israel in 722 BC, also we can see that even Judah was struggling with Assyria till the fall of Assyria. Okay, so around 100 years, around a century, uh, Judah stood alone, and it was actually struggling, and it was actually struggling with Assyria as the superpower. Okay, so the book is written in a poetical form. Okay, the book is written, the format of the book is poetical, and it is difficult to date the oracles which are spoken by Nahum. Some scholars call this book as a hymn of hatred, but it talks about the destruction of an evil empire and the future hope. So we may wonder why this is called a hymn of hate, if it is talking about the destruction of an evil empire and a future hope of Israel. So we have to understand that the way the punishment or the judgment over Israel has been portrayed or depicted, or we can say described vividly, it literally shows the hatred that the author has for the kingdom of Assyria. So it's like a song that is written out of hatred for that kingdom of Assyria. Okay, but definitely it is talking about the destruction of the evil kingdom that is Assyria. Okay, but vividly described about its judgment, and it is also talking about a future hope for Israel. In Jonah, we see God's compassion for Nineveh earlier. Okay, so earlier when Jonah had gone there and God had, prophesied, God had warned them, and the people of Nineveh had actually repented. So God had compassion on the people of Nineveh, and they were also saved at that time when Jonah had gone to them. But now, what happened to Nineveh once again? So after Jonah had come back, and after maybe those kings have gone back, we can say that the Nineveh had again fallen into a lot of sins, and it had also again become a very corrupt and very cruel nation. So the book can be dated actually between the fall of Thebes to the Assyrians in 663 BC and the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. So we can understand that this book is written before the fall of Nineveh. Okay, that is, it is before 612 BC, but it is definitely after the fall of Thebes. That means when Thebes had Assyrians had defeated Thebes in 663 BC. So it's written between 663 BC to 612 BC. The book of Nahum has never lost its significance or relevance, as among all the Dead Sea Scroll, we have found a commentary on Nahum, okay, in terms of persecution faced by Israel through the Greek ruler of Syria, and of Syria, named Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC. Thus, it can be related to an evil empire or ruler. So we can understand that the similar kind of kingdom was also found in the middle or intertestamental period at the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, and it can be related in the same way. Okay, the same kind of situations were there. So it can be related in the same way. A commentary has been found in the book of Nahum, which was read or which was spoken about and describing in the similar manner about the persecution that Israel faced during the intertestamental period. So this book actually is a very short book that opens with a contrast, a very strange kind of contrast about God, where it talks about God as an avenger and God as a savior, and moves on to show that how these two roles are fulfilled in the fall of Nineveh, revealing that God's vengeance for Assyrian atrocities and God's salvation for the nation of Judah. So the poet, I would say the poet or the prophet over here, because this is a poetic poet. This book is written in a poetry form, but it is written by a prophet. So this prophet starts immediately when he begins his prophetic book. He talks about God in two aspects. He talks about God as an avenger, and he talks about God as a savior. Avenger in the sense how God is defeating or taking vengeance from the kingdom of Nineveh or Assyria because of the atrocities that it has caused to Israel. And the secondly, the God of salvation or God's salvation for the nation of Judah, how God saves Judah from the hands of Assyria. So his words draw a graphic picture of Nineveh's demise and also a lament over the city. So these two things are found where we can see a vivid graphic pictures of how the kingdom of Nineveh is being destroyed, and then there is a lament over the city. He mourns for both the nations, for Israel also, and also he mourns for Nineveh. So there is no warning in this book. There is no warning of what was to happen after Nineveh's fall, but there is simply a promise of freedom from the Assyrians. So there is no future like what is going to happen after Nineveh's fall, but definitely there is a promise of that people will be free from the Assyrians. Okay, so the book was probably written between the fall of Thebes, as we have mentioned, that this is probably he received these oracles or he gave this message during this time. So probably this was written also during this time between 663 BC to 612 BC. Before the fall of Nineveh, this book was written. So let us look at the division of the book now. So Nahum chapter 1 verses 1 to 8, there is a description of God's character. So he begins with the description of God's character. Nahum chapter 1, verses 9 to 11, he addresses to Nineveh's leaders, okay, to the leaders of Nineveh. Then chapter 1, verse 12 to verse 12, he addresses, 12 to 13, he addresses to Judah. Then Nahum chapter 1, verse 14, he addresses to Nineveh. Nahum chapter 1, verse 15, he addresses to Judah. So last part is Nahum chapter 2, verses 1, verse chapter 3, verse 19. That is, he addresses again to Nineveh. So let's begin the study of the book. Okay, so Nahum chapter 1, verses 1 to 15. Here we are going to talk about the judgment of Nineveh, okay, or the judge of Nineveh, rather, the judge of Nineveh. Nahum chapter 1, verse 1, we can see that there is a very less information given about the prophet in these verses. Nahum simply means comfort. Okay, comfort. The name Nahum simply means comfort, and it is related to the name of another person in the Bible. As we can say, the name is similar to Nehemiah. Okay, the name is similar to Nehemiah. Nehemiah means the Lord comforts, or the comfort of the Lord. Okay, so Nahum means comfort, but Nehemiah, which is a similar name, it means the Lord comforts and comfort of the Lord. The other last part, Ayah, it is Lord. Okay, and Nahum or Nehe is comfort. Okay, so his hometown is Elkosh, which is an unidentified place. Till now geographically, though Jerome claimed that it was a place in Galilee, and others place it somewhere in Judah or Mauritius. Okay, so it's still not sure from where he belonged to, though Elkosh is the name that is given, but where is this Elkosh? It is unidentified till now. So the verse begins with an oracle concerning Nineveh, and describes it as the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. Okay, so it is very clear that Nahum the Elkoshite, he comes from Elkoshite, and his name is Nahum, and he receives a oracle about Nineveh, which happens to be the main content. So this is the main content or the main message of the book, and it follows the prophetic tradition, where we can see that mostly all the prophets talk about the destruction of the wicked or the evil nations. So Nahum is also following the same tradition and same custom, and talking about the destruction of the wicked nation. Nahum being the capital city, Nineveh being the capital city, represents the whole of the Assyrian Empire. So when we say Nineveh, it does not only mean the capital city, but it means the whole kingdom of Assyria, or the whole Assyrian Empire. So this Nineveh is representing the whole Assyrian Empire. So the Assyrians had already destroyed Samaria. They had taken the northern kingdom into captivity, and its inhabitants were dispersed into the various nations, so that they can never come back, or they can never be traced back. So they were all scattered, and they were all dispersed into other nations. Okay, so now, after dispersing, or after conquering the country of Israel, now we can say that Nineveh posed a threat. It was threatening to Judah now. So the Assyrians were extremely brutal. Okay, they were very cruel, they were very brutal, and their kings were often depicted as gloating over the gruesome punishment they inflicted over the captives. Okay, so they used to inflict a horrible kind of punishments over the people, or the kingdom that they had attacked, and it was very gruesome. The punishment was very atrocious that they were doing, and it was like they were gloating over them. They were enjoying the vision of the punishment that they were casting upon the people. So they fought wars with shocking ferocity. So it was very fearsome to face them. They uprooted and plundered the whole of the nation as their policy. So it was their policy that whichever nation they would attack, they would completely plunder, they would completely uproot it. Okay, and they would take all the captives from that nation, and they will put them into different parts, or scatter them, or disperse them into different parts of their empire or kingdom. Okay, so the leaders of the defeated nations were horribly tortured and even mutilated before they were executed. So when any kingdom was defeated, they would bring their leader or the king. They would cut their hands, or they would cut their limb, and they would gouge off their eyes, and they would cut their bodies, parts of their body, and they would just let them die. So that was a kind of death actually they gave to the kings or the rulers of the kingdoms which they conquered. The other nations dreaded Assyria and prayed for their destruction. It is very natural that if there is a kind of kingdom like Assyria, a cruel kingdom, a horrible kingdom like Assyria, then most of the nation in their fear would be calling upon God and pleading him and praying for their destruction. Okay, this is a very natural thing. This is a very normal thing that a human being would do. So Assyria, because it was so cruel, it was so dreaded by the other kingdoms prayed for their destruction, prayed for vengeance. Okay, in 700 BC, Sennacherib made Nineveh the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and it remained so till the end in 612 BC. So, though it repented when Jonah had preached earlier, but later it grew extremely wicked, brutal, and proud. Under Ashurbanipal in 669 to 627 BC, the last great ruler of the empire, it reached its peak or heights of brutality or cruelty. With the demise of the Assyrian power or fading away of the Assyrian power, Nineveh was overthrown in 712 BC and it could never ever stand again. Next, let us look at Nahum chapter 1, verses 2 to 8. Nahum immediately after talking about himself or saying that the oracle about Nineveh, he immediately gets into describing God's character. Okay, so he brings out a contrast between God as an avenger and God as a savior. In verses 2 to 3, he shows God as an avenger. He emphasizes on his covenant name, that is Yahweh, and he describes him as a jealous God who avenges or takes vengeance of his foes and will not leave the guilty unpunished. So he's a God, he's a kind of God, or Nahum describes God in such a way that this God is Yahweh, who is a very jealous God and who will avenge or who will take vengeance from their foes, and he will not leave the guilty who have sinned go unpunished. Okay, so his anger, he says that his anger and vengeance is more frightening. God's anger and vengeance is more frightening because God is said to be slow to anger. Okay, people know him as slow to anger. So when he is getting angry, that simply means that there has been something terrible done by the humankind. Okay, so if human has done something terrible, extremely terrible, only then will God's anger come upon them. Otherwise, God is very slow to anger. So he says that it is more frightening. God's anger or God's vengeance or God's anger is more frightening. So the advent of an angry God is described in terms of indicating turmoil in the world, different kinds of upheavals in the world, uh, we can say disturbances in the world, or something like a whirlwind or something like a storm. Okay, so he describes God's anger in such ways. In verse 4, he kind of brings back the memory of God dividing the Red Sea and God dividing Jordan. And he says that it is that God rebuked the sea, God rebuked the river, and it dried up. That's what Nahum is bringing out, that his anger, he when God rebuked it, when God rebuked the sea, when God rebuked the Jordan River, it dried up. So he also says that it is his anger is like when the lush green pastures of Bashan and Carmel wither. Okay, they dry and they wither, and the green slopes of Lebanon fade away when the Lord comes as a warrior God. So when God comes as a warrior God, all these things happen. The mountain and the hills tremble before him. So mountains and the hills are symbols of great stability, okay, of firmness, of great stability, दृढ़ की तरह हम देखते हैं. Okay, but we see that even the mountains and the hill, they tremble before God. This is the description of how Nahum is talking about the God as an avenger, his anger and the way he avenges. And in the midst of all these descriptions of God as an avenger, he also brings out another characteristic of God, that is the God as a savior. Okay, God as a savior, the Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust him. So he is a savior God. Okay, he's also talking about God as a savior. So he shows a balance between God as an avenger and God as a savior right in the beginning of his message. So the refuge of Judah is seen in the judgment of Nineveh. So Nahum chapter 1 verses 9 to 11. Let's look at that now. These verses are addressed to Nineveh's leaders. Okay, so now Nahum moves on to addressing the leaders of Nineveh. So he addresses the leaders of Nineveh, warning them of the coming destruction. Okay, warning them of the coming destruction. He says that plot evil against the Lord and the councils and councils wicked. So these people, the Ninevites or the Assyrians, they plot evil against the Lord and they counsel wickedness. This probably points out towards Ashurbanipal, who subdued Egypt and made King Manasseh as his vassal, as it says, one who comes forth who plots evil against the Lord. So we can see that this is probably talking about Ashurbanipal, who actually defeated Egypt and also took Judah at that time as a vassal state. Okay, and it was ill treating and mistreating Judah as well. So hence God will bring an end to their plots. So because Nineveh plots evil, he makes evil plots and he counsels wickedness. So God is going to bring judgment, or he's going to bring an end to all their plots. The judgment may be delayed, but it will definitely come. It is inevitable. Let's move ahead. Nahum chapter 1, verses 12 to 13. So, this is the second part of this chapter and consists of three specific messages. So, we can find three specific messages in this second part of this chapter, and which is actually related to the whole of the book. Okay, so let's look into that. The first message that we find over here is God is liberator. Okay, God is liberator. So there are three components in this, as God being the liberator. What is this? So let us look at God as a liberator in its three components. First one, though the foe Assyria may seem to be invincible, they will be destroyed and will be wiped away soon from the face of the earth. So the liberation through God is seen over here, that though Assyria may be very powerful, or people may think that they cannot be defeated, or they might be thinking that they are invincible, undefeatable, but God will soon wipe them away from the face of the earth. So God will liberate. Okay. Second aspect, as we can say, the second component which we can see about God as a liberator is, though in the past God had used Assyria as his instrument to bring judgment upon his people, but this affliction will come to an end. So though God has earlier used Assyria as his kingdom, as his instrument to judge or bring judgment upon Israel, but now these afflictions are going to come to an end. Okay, and God is going to stop them, and God is going to liberate. Third one is God's destruction of Assyria will simultaneously be liberation to Judah. So when God will actually defeat or destroy Assyria, it automatically will liberate Judah. Okay, so this was a message proclaimed by many of the prophets about the liberation of Judah or the chosen people. Example, we can see even about the liberation of the people of Hebrews from Egypt also. So there were a lot of messages earlier also about the chosen people being liberated from under the maybe powerful kingdoms, or under the from any kind of slavery or any kind of bondage. Okay, and Nahum also continues in that tradition, and he says and he declares it regarding his present age and his time about Judah, that Judah will be set free from or liberated from the nation of Assyria, because Assyria will be destroyed. So this message is significant even today with the gospel of Jesus Christ as our liberator. The second part of this message, as we can see here, is first part was God is liberator. Second is God is judge. Chapter 1, verse 14. So this is a divine speech addressed to Nineveh. Okay, this is a divine speech addressed to Nineveh. Now, he says it talks of no future of the Assyrian Empire, which means there will be no descendants. Okay, no descendants of the Assyrian kingdom. Then it talks about destruction of false gods, because they depended on them completely. Okay, because we can see that the people of Assyria, they depended upon their false gods. Okay, and that is why God is saying they will be completely defeated. Okay, so there will be no future, there will be no descendants, and they will be completely defeated. Next, we see that God says, I will prepare your grave for you are vile. Okay, I will prepare a grave for you are while you are wicked. So the giver of life, actually we can see that God is somebody whom we associate with, who gives life. Okay, who does not takes away life, but who gives life. But here we see that God is speaking about taking the life. Okay, so now here the giver of life announces death of the city where violence has killed compassion, where evil has conquered has conquered good. Okay, so Assyria is a place, or Nineveh is a city where we can say that the compassion has been killed. Okay, by violence. So violence is prevalent, and violence actually has killed the compassion. And we can also see that good has been killed or murdered by evil. Okay, so that is why God is going to prepare a grave for them, and the whole city is going to be buried. Next, we see that God raised the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians to destroy Nineveh in 612 BC, as prophesied by Jonah in the earlier times, and its fulfillment is mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 32, verses 22 to 23. Okay, so it's talking about the kingdoms that are going to rise against Assyria and destroy them or defeat them. The next thing, the third message that we can see over here in this portion is God is the hope of peace. So God is the liberator, God is judge, and God is the hope of peace. Chapter 1, verse 15. Here the Lord again gives hope of a peaceful future to whom? To Judah. Okay, not to Nineveh, to Judah. So he's telling that there will be a peaceful future in Judah. So Nahum announced it even before it happened. Okay, even before it happened, that the wicked invasion is over, and the feasts of the and the festivals that were suspended under the foreign pagan domination can be celebrated once again, and one day it will happen. So one day the nation of Judah will be free, and they will be celebrating their festivals and feasts and every occasion that they wanted to enjoy, and all the rituals will be done once again, and they will be celebrating their life once again. Let's move ahead. Nahum chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. Now, this talks about the siege of Nineveh. Now, this is talking about the destruction of Nineveh now. Okay, so now the vivid picturizations will begin. Nahum now addresses Nineveh rather than Judah. So, till now, he was talking to Judah about the destruction of Nineveh and how they will be liberated. But now he's addressing to Nineveh directly, though he's not gone there, but he is addressing them, not to Judah. So here Nahum creates a vivid graphic imagery of the death or the demise of the city of Nineveh, and a moving lament also he sings over the former city. So now let's look at the how he describes it. Nahum chapter 2 verses 1 to 5. The way Nahum poetically describes the siege of Nineveh is so dramatic that it almost looks like it has already happened. See, you have to understand that this is a prophetical book, this is a prophecy. It's not something that has already happened, but it is something that is going to happen. But the way Nahum is describing it, it looks like there is so much of vividity, there is so much of visual vividness in the words of Nahum over here, in his prophecy over here, that it looks like it as you can feel, or it looks like, it seems like it has already happened, and Nahum is describing what he has already seen. But this is not the case. He is prophesying right now, and the prophecies are very vivid and very clear. If he wrote after this after the fall of Thebes to the Assyrians in 663 BC, and Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC, then he wrote it about 50 years before it happened. So even before the fall of Nineveh, 50 years before the fall of Nineveh, he wrote about these things. So through the poem, one can sense the realism running through his mind. So he's actually seeing all these things and he's writing it down. So the poem vividly describes the points of vulnerability or the weaknesses of the city. Though the people of Assyria thought that they are invincible and they are very strong and they had done everything to protect their city, but this poetry or this poem actually shows their vulnerability or the weaknesses of the city or the weak points of the city. And this is the accuracy of God's prophecy, because Nahum probably never visited the city of Nineveh, but still he's talking about the weak locations and the weak points of the city. It's talking about the physical weak points, geographical weak points of the city, not talking about the spiritual things right now. So Nineveh was one of the most extraordinary city of the ancient world in the 7th century BC. So the inner city was built on the eastern banks of Tigris River, and was surrounded by a great defensive wall. So it was built in the eastern side of the banks of the Tigris River, and there was a huge defensive wall. Okay, walls around it that ran almost 8 miles in circumference. Huge wall running around 8 miles in circumference. So the wall was around 25 to 60 feet in height, and was protected by a great moat. Now, what is moat? Moat is a kind of a ditch. Okay, it's a kind of ditches that are made so where water was filled. It's broad ditches which were made long length. It's like a nala jo hum bol sakte hain. Okay, so long ditches that were made, and it was filled with water so that nobody could cross over and climb the walls. That was the kind of protection that they had given to their city. So it had 15 fortified gates and a series of ramparts and ditches beyond the wall, which protected the eastern approach to the city. Okay, so nobody could enter through the eastern side because the walls were fortified, and then there were ramparts and there were ditches. Okay, there were moats which protected the city. So the city looked impregnable, or which it looked that nobody could breach the city or come inside or break through. And its inhabitants, definitely because of this kind of protection, they felt secure. So within the inner city walls was what was there inside the city walls? There was an enormous palace, huge palace with immense stone reliefs portraying the military victory of the Assyrians. So there was a lot of imagery over there also, where there was a lot of mementos and memories of stones portraying the victories of Assyria. Okay, so near the palace was a great temple of god Ishtar, okay, which who was their patron deity, main deity of Nineveh. So though it seemed impregnable, that means that nobody could break through it, and uh, there were several vulnerable points. Okay, though it seemed that it could not be broken through, but still there were vulnerable points in the city. Chapter 2, verse 1 states that the place from where the attack will come from is from the northeast corner, okay, northeast corner of the city wall, where the road from Khorsabad approaches the city. It is a high ground overlooking into the city. It is a high ground overlooking the city. So he warns them of the coming attack and refers to the alliance of the Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians, led by Cyaxares Cyaxares the Mede, and Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian. So we can see that it actually is telling that the attack is going to come from northeast, which means these three alliances, Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians, they are going to make alliance and they're going to attack from that northeastern side. So there is an irony in his call as he asks them to marshal all their strength. So he tells the people of Nineveh, he is actually saying to the people of Nineveh that you gather up all your muscle, you gather up all your strength, because your real enemy is Yahweh himself. He's saying you gather up all your strength and see, and you come and fight, because your real enemy is Yahweh himself, who will defeat them for what they have done to the towns of Judah. So because they have been very cruel and very wicked and very brutal to the towns of Judah, they have treated them badly. That's why God or Jehovah is going to fight against them. So let them gather. So he's telling them, because you're going to fight against Yahweh, better you gather up all your and all your strength and all your army and everything and come and fight, because Yahweh is going to defeat you. No one can guard or save them from the judgment now. There is also a promise of restoring and uniting the whole nation of Israel again. So, at one side, he's talking about the judgment and the defeat of Nineveh, or how God is going to destroy Nineveh. At the same side, we can say, on the other side, we can say that he's talking about restoration of Israel. So, in the defeat of Nineveh is the restoration of Israel, or uniting of Israel. So, verse 3, we can see he describes the attackers. He says their shields are overlaid with copper, their tunics were scarlet, Scythian sights were fixed to the axle, and their chariots, and it flashed with steel. They break, he continues to describe this vivid picture as he's visualizing all these things. So they break into the city walls and give them the taste of the same medicine which they had administered to them. So the way they were violent and they were quick and they were very wicked and very cruel to them, in the same way these God is also going to treat them. All these three alliances are going to come and fight against them. So they are going to taste the same thing which they were actually making the other people taste. So they burnt down the city. Okay, though the king tried to protect the city with 150-foot wide moat, as I told you, that nala, okay, where they it is 150 feet wide, okay, 150 feet wide, and it was filled with water, so nobody could cross that water and climb the city walls. So though the king had protected the whole city with 150-foot wide moat, and the walls were high, but all this was in vain. Everything, all this protection was in vain. Though they put an up protective, though they put up protective shields made of wood and hides to deflect the stones and arrows, but the enemy is definitely going to defeat them. So, Nahum chapter 2, verses 6 to 10 now. The river Kosar that ran through the city and its water was used to fill the moats, that Nala that I was talking about. It entered through the east wall, okay, from the eastern wall, and it exited through the western walls. So it was going straight to the city. So it was entering from the east wall and exited through the western wall, and it emptied itself in the Tigris River. It still could be controlled. That was the catch here. This water still could be controlled from outside the city. And the traditions tell us that Nineveh was defeated by the manipulation or the control of this water system. So, how did it happen? Now we have to see how did this took take place. So these three kingdoms, as we can say, they have planned and they have strategized everything. So a dam was built on the Khosa River. Okay, a dam was built in the Khosa River to hold the waters. Okay, and suddenly the water was released. So we know that the work of the dam, it holds the water. Okay, and suddenly the dam was opened and the water was released. What happened? Because of the force of the water, the walls were cracked. Okay, there was a breach in the wall, and the water flooded the city, palace, and the temple. Okay, so this is how they broke the walls, broke through the walls. The city was destroyed, the palace was looted, the palace was looted, the temple prostitutes and the idols of the temple of Ishtar were destroyed. The people fled from the city like the waters draining away into the draining pool, okay, into the pools. Okay, so the people just fled from that place. The invaders carried off great quantity of plunder. So, as you have to understand that Assyrians also, whenever they attacked, they plundered the city, destroyed the city. In the same way, we see the city was destroyed and plundered. Next, we can see in chapter 2, verses 11 to 12. Here, Nahum mocks them. Now he makes fun of them and he mocks them. The city, once which was considered to be secure as the lion's den, has now been breached. So, we have to understand the picture that he's bringing out over here, how the lions protect their children, how the lions protect their cubs in their den. In the same way, the king of Nineveh or the kings of Assyria protected the city, and now that the city has been breached and the security lies in waste. So the lion was a symbol of goddess Ishtar in Nineveh. The destruction of the lion's den is therefore associated with the destruction of the temple. The kings of Nineveh also called themselves lion. Okay, they also says that they are lions who terrorized the West Asia, but now they could not even protect their cubs. So these lions and their dens were all destroyed now. Chapter 2, verse 13. Here the prophet gives us the basis of the whole prophecy. The alliance of the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians was not the reason for the defeat of Nineveh. It was the Lord Almighty, Yahweh, because Yahweh declared, I am against you. So it is not the Babylonians, it is not the Medes, or it is not the Scythians, or it is not their alliance that together and their strength that defeated Nineveh, but it is the Lord Almighty who said that He is against them. He's against Nineveh. Nineveh was tried and found guilty, and hence it was sentenced to destruction. It was not just another war, but the defeat of evil. It was not just another war fought as a battle fought between two kingdoms, but it was a defeat of evil. The stench of atrocities of the years now ended. So Assyria was actually considered to be the most brutal, the most evil, the most, most wicked kingdom, because they were horrible in their treatment towards the other nations. So now they were defeated and these atrocities had ended. The fruit of evil eventually haunted the perpetrators. Nahum now reminds us of the frailty of human pride and strength and suggests that we need to seek more enduring city than Nineveh. So Nineveh and its people were very proud of their strength and very proud of their achievements, but it is all frail. It is all frail. Human pride and strength is all frail. And he says that we should seek for a city that is more stronger than Nineveh. Okay, now let us move to the last chapter of this book, chapter 3, verses 1 to 19, Nineveh and Thebes. So there is a comparison between, or a similarity that he draws between both the cities. Nahum chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. In verse 1, he describes the city as follows. The city of Nineveh is the city of blood because of its bloody massacres, because it killed so many people. There was so much violence. Second, it is full of plunder because it looted all the conquered nations. Third, it never was without victims. So there were always victims in the country. They were known for their brutality and terrible atrocities. Its victims were beheaded, impaled, or burnt. Okay, so they were just the head was cut, or they were hung on the wood, or they were burnt alive, or their body parts were mutilated, and they were just left like that to die. They were skinned alive. Their eyes were gouged out, and their heads were, I mean, the hair were removed. It was horrible the way they were tortured the people, especially the kings. Okay, sometimes they made small cages, square small cages where the kings were placed, and they could neither stand nor sleep. So it was a very horrible position that they were put into throughout till they died. Okay, so verse 5, we can say it resounds the verse, chapter 2, verse 3, again stating that the Lord Almighty declares, I am against you, because they were so wicked and they were so atrocious in their character that God says, I am against you. So the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III boasted that he will erect a pyramid with the chopped off heads in front of the enemy city. But now, instead, the city will be filled with the piles of dead, with people stumbling over the corpse. So we can see King Shalmaneser of Assyria. He boasted that he's going to build a pyramid. Pyramid of what? Not of bricks, not of stones, nothing. But he said the of the heads, cut off heads of the defeated nations or people of the nations. Okay, so he will do that in the front of their own city. But now, what does God do? God now is going to fill the city of Nineveh with piles of dead people, with corpses against whom the people are going to stumble and fall. So there will be so many corpse in the city that people will not be able to walk. They will just stumble and fall over these corpses. In verse 2 to 3, we can see that Nahum vividly describes the attack of the conqueror. Okay, the attack of the conqueror. Now he's very clearly picturizing how the conqueror is going to attack. So the crack of the whip and the rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and bounding chariot, horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end. They stumble over their bodies. So these men, these people who are, horses who are galloping, the men who are walking, soldiers who are going forth with their swords and all these glittering spears and everything, they will be stumbling over the bodies of their own people because God is going to destroy them. So there will be more dead people in the city or corpse in the city than people alive. So the reason of their destruction is given in verse 4. Their love for their chief goddess Ishtar. This is one of the main reasons why they are going to be judged. Their love for their goddess Ishtar, her temple prostitutes. They had even enslaved other nations by the lure of wealth and luxury through sorceries and witchcraft. So they used sorcery and witchcraft actually to lure the people of the other nations and other countries and try to bring them into temple prostitution and worship Ishtar goddess. So the punishment mentioned in verses 5 and 6 were that of a prostitute, that they will be naked, their clothes will be ripped off and they will be made naked. So these kind of punishments are mentioned in verses 5 and 6, and this is a punishment that is given to prostitutes and adulteresses, which is found in the Bible, as in we can read over here. Okay, this is how it simply means that God is going to do that to the nation. Okay, the sad words of verse 7 states that they would receive no sympathy. Means God is not going to show any kind of sympathy to them. Chapter 3, verses 8 to 10. Now he compares Nineveh's fate to that of Thebes. Okay, so Assyria had defeated Thebes at one time. The way it has defeated Thebes, in the same way it is going to be defeated also. So in the Upper Nile, we can see that Thebes in the Upper Nile region. Okay, this belongs to the Upper Nile region. Just as Thebes fell, so will Nineveh fall. Thebes was the great capital of the Upper Egypt and was one of the most splendid city of Egypt. It was only second to Memphis. Memphis was the first or the top in its glory and its strength. Like Nineveh, it was also built beside a river on the eastern banks of Nile, and Karnak and Luxor, with their once great temple and palace within the city. So if you remember, Nineveh also had the city walls, and it had the palace and the temple. Okay, in the same way, Thebes also had it. It had the city walls, it had its temple, and it had its palace. Towards the west of Nile, there were we can say there were temples, okay, temples of generations of pharaohs in the towards the west of the steep cliffs. Okay, so there were clusters of these temples of the generations of Pharaoh towards the east or the towards the sorry west of Nile. So further west in the foothills lay the Valley of Kings, where the tombs of the new kingdom which were actually guarded. Okay, so we can say there was tombs of these kings at the foothills. So, with the Nile on one side and the steep cliffs on the other banks, Thebes was almost invincible. So, it could also not be destroyed. Yet, we can see God used Ashurbanipal, who conquered them in 663 BC. So, just as Thebes was conquered by Ashurbanipal, in the same way, Nineveh will also fall. So, the comparison between Thebes and Nineveh shows us that an impregnable city can be breached. Okay? An impregnable city can also be breached. The cities like Thebes and alike will not go unpunished. They cannot be unpunished. They cannot go unpunished. As they did evil to the others, so will they receive the same. Okay, so what they did to others, they are going to receive the same thing for themselves also. Nahum chapter 3, verses 11 to 18. Now the Assyrian kings will drink the same cup of God's wrath and will go into hiding. These verses talk of a defeat and destruction and warning to the king of Assyria, kings of Assyria. So Assyrian fortress will fall. Okay, it will fall like the ripe fig. Okay, like a ripe fig, how it falls into the mouth of an eater. When you want to eat, it just falls into the mouth of an eater. Okay, in the same way, Assyria's fortress will also fall. Okay, it will be looted. Okay, it will be looted. His troops of soldiers are like women. So he's describing again, it's all picturizations, it's all visions that he's drawing over here. So his troops of soldiers are like women who are unable to stand against this invading army. So the women are weak enough to stand before the soldiers or this army. So it's like that. We can say the soldiers are like that, that he is visualizing. So the bars of the gates are of no use. Okay, these pillars and the bars of the gate are of no use as they have been burnt down and opened to the invaders, so the invaders can come in. He sarcastically wants them to draw water for the siege and strengthen his defense, because there was a moat around the city, as we can see. So they used to fill that moat with water. So he's saying that only, that draw water for the siege and strengthen the defense. Okay, although it is of no use, since the fire is going to destroy them, and they would be cut down like grasshoppers. So whatever kind of defense they want to use, let them use, but the fire is going to burn them down, and they are going to be cut down like grasshoppers. So history and archaeology also confirms to us that the Assyrian king actually died in the flames of his own palace. So his palace was burnt down. The enemy is described as locust. Okay, the enemy was going to come and attack over them is described as locust, who suddenly multiplied. Okay, who suddenly multiplies. We know that these locusts suddenly multiply in the desert. Okay, and they come from the desert as a destructive plague, and they just eat up all the vegetation, eat up all the green plants and the fields and everything, and nothing is left behind. So these enemies are going to come like that. The Babylonians, the Scythians, and the Medes, they're going to come like that as a locust suddenly rising and multiplying, and they are going to come and they're going to just empty the city, destroy the city completely, and leave nothing behind. So, though Assyria has a vast trading and commercial enterprise, but its merchants will strip the land of its treasures in the time of adversity. So, its own merchants, Assyria's own merchants, are going to loot, or they are going to strip off their own nations or the treasuries of their own nation. Nineveh's officials' exploitative action will wipe Nineveh off at the time of destruction, like swarms of locusts swipe off the land. So he's saying that internally, the people internally, only the officials of Nineveh, the traders of Nineveh, they are themselves going to just wipe off. They are themselves going to just exploit the city and just lick it off. They're just going to gloat over it, and they're just going to take away all the riches and wipe off the land for their own benefit. So it's internal. So Nahum here is talking about the internal enemies that are inside the city rather than talking about the external ones. Its officials will disappear without a trace after stripping. So after stripping the whole city, they are just going to disappear from that, so that nobody knows who destroyed the city or who stripped the city and how it got buried. Okay, so where Nineveh was buried, so we can see that only nobody knows actually what happened to Nineveh at that time, but only after the excavation in 1845, 1845 BC, it came to be known that it was buried and it was then excavated by the archaeologists. So Nahum prophetically addresses the reigning city, King Shin Shar Ishkun, warning him that there is no hope as his leaders were asleep and they were not ready for the disaster. So he says to the king Sinshar Ishkun that your leaders are not ready for the battle, your leaders are not ready, your shepherds are not ready for the disaster, so nobody can protect them or save them. This would lead to the nobles being killed and people scattered, okay, because they're going to be destroyed, they're going to be caught without preparation. So all the nobles are going to be killed and people are going to be scattered because there will be no defense to protect them from this coming destruction. It was to be a complete defeat. Lastly, in chapter 3, verse 19, in his postscript, we can see that Nahum gives reasons for the disaster, asking asking, who has not felt your endless cruelty? Your injury is fatal, so that nothing can heal. So he's saying that you have been so cruel to so many nations. Who has not felt that cruelty from you? Who has not actually prayed against you? And your injuries are so fatal and so painful. And in the same way, you will also be receiving these fatal injuries. Nineveh was completely destroyed in 612 BC and was never ever rebuilt within centuries. It was covered with wind blown sand. So it was, the whole city was under sand. That great city fell, never to rise again, in fulfillment of what God said to Nahum. Now it stands as a warning. Okay, this incident stands as a warning to other cruel conquerors since then, that if they are cruel, if they behave like this, or if they treat other nations or other people in such a cruel manner, then God is against them and they will be destroyed and defeated completely, and no trace of their kingdom or their nation will ever be found. This is all for the class of Nahum. I hope you all have been able to pay attention and you all are able to study following these lectures. Thank you. God bless you as you prepare for your exams. God bless you.